For hundreds of years, musicians have demonstrated feats of virtuosity by performing entire concerts completely from memory. But before the 19th century in Western history, performing without the score was viewed as arrogant and ostentatious, putting too much attention on the performer and away from the music. Although there were records of some musicians performing from memory during this time, such as Mozart, it was largely frowned upon due to the danger of not remembering the score correctly. Music at the time had a large emphasis on improvisation and sight reading, but as music tastes evolved into the 19th century, there was a shift away from improvisational music and a rise in popularity for canon, or faithful reproductions of historical compositions. Memorization soon replaced improvisation as the favored way of showing virtuosity, as demonstrated by musicians such as Paganini, Mendelssohn, Clara Vick Schumann, and Liszt. Audiences went to concert halls craving showmanship, and because memorization was still a rare thing, performers began using it as a way to distinguish themselves. Regardless, memorization would still be discouraged for half the century, with some critics stating that acts of daring belonged to the circus and not the domain of art. But by 1860, attitudes began to shift. Playing from memory became more common, not just among professionals, but also with amateur music learners. Some still try to dismiss the practice as fashion or fad, but in fact, memorization has now become the standard today for all solo music performances, competitions, and even the humble student recital. But are we all just memorizing for show, as a way to prove a level of proficiency, talent, or commitment, pushed upon us by people who believed only those pianists whose musicianship is broad enough to study their programs in every detail are worth hearing, and it follows without question that such will always play from memory? This long-standing tradition has now built itself into our cultural view of what makes a talented and abled solo performer. But societal views aside, are there any true benefits of playing from memory? It's argued that memorization allows for a more expressive performance. The musician who plays from memory is as the bird that flies unfettered. The musician, however, who is tied to his notes is as the bird that is tied to a string. Pianist Stephen Hoff experiences it as a hard-to-describe expansiveness because I'm untethered from a score and my brain isn't processing so much visual information. In my own experience, playing from memory offers a level of freedom and expression that cannot be felt when playing with the score. It's like the difference between how well you know an acquaintance versus how well you know your closest friends. The better you know the person, or in this case, the music, the more intimate and deep the conversation you can have. That being said, memorization has never been something easy for me to do, and even if I'm successful at memorizing a piece, it's so hard to hold on to. The minute I start learning something new, my memory of the piece prior will deteriorate. Why is it so difficult to memorize? In this video, I will be deep diving into the way memorization works in hopes that better understanding the process will help me memorize pieces more easily and retain them in my memory. I think the most logical place to start is by understanding how memory works. It can sometimes feel as though our memories are stored in a vault or library with limited space, but actually our memories are not stored in one single place. Instead, individual memories are scattered across the brain, with different brain cells working together to create one single memory. So in the case of learning music, one part of the brain remembers how the piece sounds, another part remembers how your fingers should move, another part remembers individual notes or chords, and another part remembers how it makes you feel. The memory happens when all these individual neurons fire in a specific pattern. The stronger the neural pathways, the more quickly we can recall the memory. In the simplest of terms, when we learn or experience something, information is taken in by our sensory memory, which then gets processed by our short-term memory. And if we find that information is important, it will then be encoded by the hippocampus into our long-term memory. I think this is where we want to focus our attention, as memorization is essentially turning our short-term memories into long-term memories. But again, returning back to my original question, Why is this so difficult to do? According to Boundless Psychology, memory consolidation is a category of processes that stabilize a memory trace after its initial acquisition. Consolidation affects how well a memory will be remembered after it is stored. If it is encoded and consolidated well, the memory will be easily retrieved in full detail. But if encoding or consolidation is neglected, the memory will not be retrieved or may not be accurate. Okay, so that makes sense. If the information wasn't encoded or consolidated well from short-term to long-term memory, it's going to be more difficult to recall. Additionally, memories that aren't used very often will fade over time. Something I know all too well, as the longer I stop practicing a piece, the harder it is to remember how to play it. Luckily, that's the easier problem to solve, as I'm sure you know, practice, repetition, and consistency are essential for maintaining our repertoire. The harder question to answer is, how do we encode the information into our memories well? For this, I turn to the research done by Roger Chaffin, a professor of psychology at the University of Connecticut. He has done several case studies with professional musicians to better understand how musical memory works. In 2002, Chaffin collaborated with concert pianist Gabriela Imreh, recording her practices as she learned the third movement, Presto, of J.S. Bach's Italian Concerto. Imre provided her first-person perspective as the musician, recording her thoughts during the learning process, while Chaffin provided the third-person perspective of the scientist, offering objective and analytical interpretations of her intuitive musical judgments. Imre acknowledged that motor and auditory memory are the essential first steps towards memorizing, but she couldn't rely on them as her primary sources of memory. If anything went wrong during a performance, which it often does, the performer needs to know where they are in the piece to bring it back on track. This requires the use of conceptual memory to restart the motor process. Conceptual memory is when a meaningful stimuli, such as a word, picture, or object, triggers associated information from our long-term memory. For example, using a mnemonic device like Roy G. Biv to remember the color order of the rainbow. In terms of music, there are many different stimuli that we can use to trigger our long-term memory. The most common one would be sections. Pieces are usually written with some type of structure, and if we break the piece up and practice it in its different sections, these starting and stopping places become the triggers for our memory. Chaffin more eloquently refers to these triggers as performance cues. He defines performance cues as landmarks in the mental map of the piece that a musician monitors during performance to ensure that critical aspects of the performance go as planned. For example, a fingering that sets the hand up for what follows. They are created by repeatedly attending to a particular feature of the music during practice, so it comes to mind automatically during performance, eliciting from memory the thoughts and actions that have been linked with it during practice. Chaffin distinguishes 4 different types of performance cues. 1. Structural cues, critical places in the formal structure of the music, such as section boundaries. 2. Expressive cues, main musical turning points of the piece where the musical feeling changes. 3. Interpretive cues, places where some aspect of interpretation requires attention, for example, a change of tempo or change of dynamics. 4. Basic cues, critical details of technique that must be executed as planned, for example, the placement of the hand for a jump. I think this is the difference between a poorly encoded memory and a well-encoded memory. A poorly encoded memory would be dependent on motor or muscle memory alone, and like Imra mentioned, depending only on that is extremely risky for performance. A well-encoded memory links the motor memory to a specific performance cue, or in other words, thinking of the performance cue activates the muscle memory that we built during practice. I think the important takeaway is that these performance cues need to be clearly defined, even marked or highlighted in the score, and then intentionally practiced, meaning you're deliberately thinking of the performance cue as you're practicing the section until it becomes almost an automatic thing. During her performance of Bach's Italian Concerto, Imreh stated, "A lot of my practice was practicing throwing those switches. My fingers were playing the notes just fine. The practice I needed was in my head. I had to learn to keep track of where I was. It was a matter of learning exactly what I needed to be thinking of as I played and at exactly what point, so that as I approached a switching point, I would automatically think about where I was and which way the switch would go." On her first attempt at playing from memory, most hesitations happened at performance cues or at the end of sections. The hesitations happened because the retrieval of the performance cues in the mind was too slow to keep up with the performance. In the following practice sessions, Imreh went to great lengths to ensure she could depend on her conceptual memory, in addition to the motor and auditory ones, by dedicating prolonged practice to bring the speed of her mental retrieval up to the pace of her motor performance. Thinking of the piece in terms of conceptual representations also allowed her to focus on expressive goals during performance, and it kept her on track of where she was in the piece. Chaffin states, "Ideally, the pianist plays with the expressive cues in the spotlight of attention against a background of basic and interpretive performance cues and structural knowledge. When this happens, the performer experiences flow, a trance-like state in which the notes have become you and you have become the notes." Now, while all of this sounds great, the study was done with a professional musician, but will it work with someone less experienced? The process was actually tested in a case study in 2015 at the Royal College of Music with a teacher and piano student referred to as Maria. Maria was 18 years old and took piano lessons since she was 4, but she never deliberately memorized a piece before. She may have incidentally memorized a piece just from learning how to play it, but after a few weeks, she would no longer be able to play it from memory. Her teacher encouraged her to learn a new piece from memory by recording what she was thinking during her practice and when she performed for her teacher each week. Her thoughts would be written directly on the score and color-coded depending on what type of performance cue that it was, basic, interpretive, or expressive. Maria was able to successfully memorize the piece over a 6.5-week period and was even able to reconstruct the piece from memory 9.5 weeks later without having practiced it during that time. One of the most interesting things about the study was that Maria's performance cues changed over time. Initially, her performance cues focused on more basic ones, like specific notes or hand positions, but as the weeks progressed and she got more familiar with the piece, her performance cues transitioned into more interpretive and expressive ones, like how she wanted the piece to feel. When she reconstructed the piece from memory 9.5 weeks later, Maria's performance cues served as the retrieval cues that helped her remember. Performance cues make it possible to recall specific passages in a piece of music by providing a mental address. By thinking of a location in the piece, the musician is able to recall the details of what happens there. This is what is meant by content-addressable memory. So, to answer my original question, why is memorizing so difficult? The way that we practice memorizing has a large impact on how well the music stays in our memory. As the case studies have shown, memorization was intentionally practiced using specific performance cues and didn't rely on mindless repetition and muscle memory alone. Before doing this research, I was already utilizing some of the strategies, like breaking the piece into structural cues and thinking of sections in terms of the feeling I wanted to express, but I didn't realize that these performance cues were triggering my muscle memory. I also wasn't practicing deliberately thinking of the performance cues as I approached them, and kind of depended on my body to automatically know what to do next. Now I'm starting to write my performance cues into the score, similar to how Maria did, and I'm going to see if this will help me memorize more easily. Something that I didn't get to touch on in this video are the effects of outside stressors on memory, such as stage fright or performance pressure. But that's also something that's been a challenge for me ever since I was a kid, so I definitely want to explore that in another video. But that's all I have for this one. I really hope that you found it helpful. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.